Frederick Douglass was a self-educated slave who became one of America's greatest orators and abolitionists, a man who rose from bondage to become the conscience of a nation. Frederick Douglass, the most photographed American of the 19th century, was born into slavery in Talbot County, Maryland in February 1818. The exact date of his birth remains uncertain, as was common for enslaved people, though he later chose to celebrate it on February 14th. He was born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, a name he would later change when he escaped to freedom. His mother was Harriet Bailey, an enslaved woman, and his father was widely rumored to be a white man, possibly his owner. Frederick was separated from his mother when he was an infant, a cruel but common practice designed to break familial bonds among the enslaved. He saw his mother only a handful of times before her death when he was 7 years old, visits she made by walking 12 miles at night after working all day in the fields. Young Frederick was raised by his grandmother Betsy Bailey on a plantation owned by Aaron Anthony. At the age of 6, he was taken from his grandmother and sent to live on the Y House plantation, the home of his master. The separation was traumatic, marking the beginning of his conscious awareness of the brutality of slavery. In 1826, when Frederick was 8 years old, he was sent to Baltimore to live with Hugh Auld and his wife Sophia. This move would prove to be a turning point in his life. Sophia Auld, not yet hardened by the corrupting influence of slaveholding, began teaching young Frederick the alphabet. When Hugh Auld discovered this, he forbade his wife from continuing the lessons, declaring that education would make the boy unfit for slavery. But those words had the opposite effect on Frederick. He realized that literacy was the pathway from slavery to freedom, and he became determined to educate himself. Frederick continued his education in secret, trading bread with poor white children in exchange for reading lessons. He studied discarded newspapers, copied letters from lumber at the shipyard, and read every book he could find. At 12 years old, he purchased a copy of the Columbian Orator, a collection of speeches about liberty, democracy, and courage. The book awakened in him a burning desire for freedom and gave him the language to articulate the injustice of slavery. In 1833, Frederick was sent back to the Eastern Shore to work for Thomas Auld, who found the teenager difficult to control. Auld sent him to work for Edward Covey, a farmer known as a slave breaker who had a reputation for crushing the spirits of rebellious slaves. For 6 months, Covey worked Frederick mercilessly and whipped him regularly. But one day in August 1834, Frederick fought back. When Covey attempted to tie him up for another beating, the 16-year-old Frederick resisted, and the two men fought for nearly 2 hours. Covey never touched him again. This physical resistance was a spiritual resurrection for Frederick. He later wrote that the fight rekindled the few expiring embers of freedom within him, and revived a sense of his own manhood. He was still enslaved, but he was no longer a slave in spirit. Frederick was then sent to work for William Freeland, a comparatively more lenient master, but Frederick's desire for freedom only grew stronger. He began conducting a secret school for fellow slaves, teaching them to read the New Testament on Sundays. In 1836, he planned an escape with several other enslaved men, but they were betrayed before they could flee. Frederick was jailed and feared he would be sold to plantations in the Deep South, a fate considered worse than death. Instead, he was sent back to Baltimore to learn the trade of ship caulking. In Baltimore, Frederick worked in the shipyards and was allowed to hire out his time, though he had to give his wages to Hugh Auld. During this period, he met Anna Murray, a free black woman who worked as a domestic servant. Anna was literate, independent, and became Frederick's partner in planning his escape. On September 3, 1838, disguised as a sailor and carrying papers borrowed from a free black seaman, 20-year-old Frederick Bailey boarded a train heading north. The journey was terrifying, with several close calls when conductors and passengers scrutinized his papers. But within 24 hours, he arrived in New York City, a free man. He had escaped slavery, but he was not yet safe. Slave catchers prowled northern cities, and the Fugitive Slave Act meant he could be captured and returned to bondage at any time. Anna Murray joined him in New York, and they were married on September 15, 1838. To avoid capture, they moved to New Bedford, Massachusetts, and Frederick took a new surname, Douglass, inspired by a character in Sir Walter Scott's poem The Lady of the Lake. Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey had become Frederick Douglass. In New Bedford, Douglass worked as a laborer while becoming active in the abolitionist movement. He attended meetings of the Anti-Slavery Society and subscribed to William Lloyd Garrison's abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator. In August 1841, Douglass was invited to speak at an anti-slavery convention in Nantucket. He was reluctant and nervous, but when he took the stage and told his story, the audience was electrified. His powerful voice, commanding presence, and eloquent testimony about the horrors of slavery made an immediate impact. William Lloyd Garrison, the leading white abolitionist, spoke after Douglass and asked the crowd, "Shall such a man be held a slave in a Christian land?" The crowd roared back, "Never." The Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society immediately hired Douglass as a lecturer. For the next several years, he traveled throughout the North, speaking to audiences about his experiences in slavery and advocating for abolition. But some people doubted his story. How could someone so articulate and refined have been a slave? To silence the skeptics, Douglass decided to write his autobiography. In 1845, Douglass published Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. The book was a sensation, selling thousands of copies and being translated into several languages. It was a searing indictment of slavery, written with literary skill and moral clarity. Douglass named his former owners and described specific events, which proved his authenticity but also put him in grave danger. As a fugitive slave, publishing his story with such detail meant he could be captured and returned to Maryland. Friends urged him to leave the country, and in August 1845, Douglass sailed to Ireland and Britain. He spent nearly 2 years touring Ireland, Scotland, and England, speaking to enthusiastic audiences and raising money for the abolitionist cause. The British treated him as an equal, a stark contrast to the discrimination he faced in America. He later wrote that he could ride on any railway, sit in any seat, eat at any table, and sleep in any bed without insult. British supporters raised funds to purchase his freedom, and in December 1846, Hugh Auld signed manumission papers. Frederick Douglass was legally free. Douglass returned to America in 1847 with enough money to start his own abolitionist newspaper. He moved his family to Rochester, New York, and began publishing the North Star, named after the celestial guide that escaping slaves followed to freedom. The newspaper's motto was "Right is of no sex, truth is of no color, God is the Father of us all, and we are all brethren," reflecting Douglass's commitment not only to abolition but also to women's rights and universal human equality. Douglass was one of the few men to attend the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, the first women's rights convention in America, and he spoke eloquently in support of women's suffrage. Publishing the North Star put Douglass at odds with William Lloyd Garrison, who believed moral persuasion alone would end slavery. Douglass had come to believe that political action was necessary, and he supported the Liberty Party and later the Republican Party. The split with Garrison was bitter, but Douglass was charting his own course. Douglass's home in Rochester became a station on the Underground Railroad. He and Anna sheltered hundreds of escaped slaves, providing them with food, clothing, and money as they made their way to Canada. Douglass worked closely with Harriet Tubman, whom he deeply admired for her courage in repeatedly returning to the South to lead others to freedom. He also befriended John Brown, the radical abolitionist who believed armed insurrection was the only way to end slavery. In 1859, Brown asked Douglass to join him in his raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Douglass refused, believing the plan was suicidal and would harm the abolitionist cause. When Brown's raid failed and he was executed, Douglass fled to Canada and then to England, fearing he would be arrested as a co-conspirator. Letters between Douglass and Brown had been discovered, and Douglass's name was mentioned in the investigation. He returned to America in 1860 after the controversy died down and just months before his daughter Annie died at the age of 10, a devastating personal loss. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 and the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 transformed the political landscape. Initially, Lincoln insisted the war was about preserving the Union, not ending slavery. Douglass was frustrated and used his newspaper and speeches to pressure Lincoln to make emancipation a war aim and to allow black men to fight for their freedom. Douglass argued that the war would never be won without striking at the heart of the rebellion, which was slavery itself. He declared that the Negro is the key to the situation, the pivot upon which the whole rebellion turns. In 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all slaves in Confederate territory were free. Douglas praised the proclamation but knew it was only a first step. He also criticized Lincoln for not granting equal pay and treatment to black soldiers who were finally allowed to enlist in the Union Army. Douglas became a recruiting agent for the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, one of the first official black units in the Union Army. Two of his sons, Charles and Louis, enlisted. Douglas traveled throughout the North, urging black men to join the fight, telling them that once you let the black man get upon his person the brass letters US, let him get an eagle on his button and a musket on his shoulder, and there is no power on earth which can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship. But when black soldiers were paid less than white soldiers and faced harsher punishments, Douglas stopped recruiting and demanded a meeting with President Lincoln. In August 1863, Douglas met Lincoln at the White House. It was a historic meeting, the first time a black leader had been received by a president as an equal. Lincoln listened to Douglas's concerns and promised that black soldiers would eventually receive equal pay, though he defended the initial inequality as a necessary compromise to get white soldiers to accept black troops. Douglas left the meeting impressed by Lincoln's honesty and believing the president was genuinely committed to freedom, even if progress was slower than Douglas wanted. Douglas met with Lincoln again in 1864, when the president asked for his help in devising a plan to encourage more slaves to escape to Union lines before the war ended. Lincoln feared he might not win re-election and that a new administration might negotiate peace without ending slavery. Douglas developed a plan, but it became unnecessary when Lincoln won re-election and the war turned decisively in favor of the Union. On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, effectively ending the Civil War. 5 days later, President Lincoln was assassinated. Douglas mourned Lincoln deeply, calling him emphatically the black man's president, the first to show any respect for their rights as men. With slavery abolished by the 13th Amendment, Douglas turned his attention to ensuring that formerly enslaved people would have full citizenship rights. He advocated for the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship, and the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed voting rights regardless of race. But Douglas knew that legal rights meant little without economic opportunity and education, and he continued to speak out against the injustices faced by black Americans during Reconstruction. In 1872, Douglas moved to Washington, D.C., which would remain his home for the rest of his life. He purchased a grand estate called Cedar Hill in Anacostia, becoming the first black man to own property in that neighborhood. Some neighbors objected, but Douglas refused to be intimidated. He continued to write, speak, and advocate for civil rights, women's suffrage, and social justice. In 1877, President Rutherford B. Hayes appointed Douglas as United States Marshal for the District of Columbia, making him the first African American to hold such a high federal position. He later served as Recorder of Deeds for Washington, D.C., and in 1889, President Benjamin Harrison appointed him as Minister to Haiti, representing American interests in the Black Republic. Douglas's personal life also underwent significant change. Anna Murray Douglas, his wife of 44 years, died in 1882. She had been a partner in his escape from slavery and had supported his work throughout their marriage, though she remained largely in the background, never learning to read or write fluently. In 1884, Douglas married Helen Pitts, a white feminist and former secretary who was nearly 20 years his junior. The interracial marriage caused a scandal and drew criticism from both black and white communities. Douglas responded that his first wife was the color of my mother and the second the color of my father, dismissing the controversy with characteristic wit and principle. Throughout the 1880s and 1890s, Douglas remained active, speaking against lynching, Jim Crow laws, and the erosion of civil rights gains made during Reconstruction. He was deeply disappointed by the failure of America to live up to its promises to formerly enslaved people. The Reconstruction era had ended, and the South was systematically disenfranchising black voters and instituting segregation. Douglas watched with anger and sorrow as the nation abandoned its commitment to racial equality. Yet he never stopped believing in the possibility of American democracy and never stopped demanding that America live up to its founding ideals. he continued to revise and expand his autobiography, publishing My Bondage and My Freedom in 1855 and Life and Times of Frederick Douglass in 1881, with a final revision in 1892. These works documented not only his personal journey but the larger story of America's struggle with slavery and freedom. Douglass was also a pioneering figure in the use of photography. He was the most photographed American of the 19th century, sitting for more portraits than even Abraham Lincoln. Douglass understood the power of images and carefully controlled how he was represented, always appearing dignified, serious, and refined. He believed that photographs could counter racist caricatures and show the world that black people were fully human and deserving of respect. On February 20, 1895, Frederick Douglass attended a meeting of the National Council of Women in Washington, D.C., where he received a standing ovation. He returned home to Cedar Hill that evening and was telling Helen about the meeting when he suddenly collapsed. Frederick Douglass died of a heart attack at the age of 77. His death was mourned across the nation and around the world. Thousands attended his funeral in Washington, and memorial services were held in cities throughout America and in Europe. Tributes poured in from leaders, activists, and ordinary citizens whose lives he had touched. Douglass had lived long enough to see slavery abolished, but not long enough to see the full promise of freedom realized for African Americans. The struggles he fought would continue for generations. Yet his legacy was secure. Frederick Douglass had transformed himself from a piece of property into one of the most influential Americans of his century. He had used the power of words and the force of his moral conviction to challenge a nation to live up to its ideals. He had been a slave, an abolitionist, an orator, a writer, a newspaper editor, a diplomat, and above all, a champion of human dignity and freedom. Douglass's life was a testament to the power of education, the strength of the human spirit, and the possibility of change. He proved that one person, armed with courage and truth, could make a difference. His writings remain essential texts in American literature and history, his speeches still inspire those who fight for justice, and his example continues to challenge us to confront the contradictions between our ideals and our actions. Frederick Douglass was born a slave but died a statesman. He was denied his freedom but claimed it for himself and then spent his life helping others claim theirs. He was told he was property but proved he was a person of extraordinary gifts and unshakable principles. He faced a nation that denied his humanity and forced it to recognize not only his humanity but the humanity of all enslaved and oppressed people. In death, as in life, Frederick Douglass remained a towering figure in American history, a voice for the voiceless, and a reminder that the arc of history bends toward justice only when people like him refuse to accept injustice. Harriet Tubman was a woman of extraordinary courage who escaped slavery and became a conductor on the Underground Railroad, leading hundreds to freedom. Harriet Tubman, one of America's greatest heroes, was born into slavery in Dorchester County, Maryland around March 1822. She came from a family of enslaved people who worked on plantations in the brutal system of Southern slavery. Tubman's birth name was Araminta Ross, though she would later take her mother's name, Harriet. She had a small stature but possessed an iron will. Tubman's early years were marked by hardship and suffering. She was forced to work from the age of 5 or 6, first as a house servant and later in the fields. Harriet Tubman experienced the cruelty of slavery firsthand, enduring beatings and abuse throughout her childhood. In her early teens, around 1834 or 1835, Tubman suffered a traumatic head injury that would affect her for the rest of her life. An overseer threw a heavy metal weight at another enslaved person but hit Tubman instead, fracturing her skull. The injury caused her to experience seizures, severe headaches, and narcoleptic episodes for the remainder of her days. She also began having vivid dreams and visions which she interpreted as messages from God. Despite this debilitating injury, Tubman continued to work in the fields, developing tremendous physical strength and endurance. She learned to navigate the woods and swamps of Maryland, skills that would prove invaluable in her future work. Tubman also developed a deep Christian faith that sustained her through the darkest times, believing that God had chosen her for a special purpose. In 1844, Araminta Ross married a free black man named John Tubman and took the name Harriet. The marriage gave her some measure of emotional support, but she remained enslaved while her husband was free. This disparity troubled her deeply, as she longed for the freedom that seemed so close yet remained out of reach. When Harriet's enslaver died in 1849, she feared she would be sold south to the Deep South, where conditions were even more brutal and escape nearly impossible. She made the bold decision to run away, even though it meant leaving her husband behind. John Tubman refused to accompany her and even threatened to report her plans to their enslaver. In the fall of 1849, Harriet Tubman escaped slavery, making the dangerous 90-mile journey from Maryland to Pennsylvania alone. She traveled by night, following the North Star and using the Underground Railroad, a secret network of safe houses and abolitionists who helped enslaved people reach freedom. Tubman later recalled the moment she crossed into Pennsylvania as one of transcendent joy, saying she looked at her hands to see if she was the same person now that she was free. She felt like she was in heaven. But her happiness was incomplete because her family remained in bondage. Tubman settled in Philadelphia, where she found work as a domestic servant and cook. She saved her money and began planning something extraordinary. Within a year of gaining her own freedom, Harriet Tubman made the dangerous decision to return to Maryland to rescue her family. This was not the action of someone content with personal liberty. Tubman could not rest while those she loved remained enslaved. In 1850, she made her first rescue mission, returning to Maryland to bring her niece and her niece's children to freedom. This was just the beginning of what would become her life's mission. Over the next decade, Tubman would make approximately 13 trips back into slave territory, personally leading around 70 enslaved people to freedom, including her brothers and her elderly parents. She gave detailed instructions to dozens more who found their own way north using her guidance. Harriet Tubman became one of the most famous conductors on the Underground Railroad. She operated with meticulous planning and extraordinary courage, never losing a passenger on her dangerous journeys. Tubman carried a gun for protection and to ensure that once people started the journey with her, they would not turn back and potentially expose the operation under torture or interrogation. She was absolutely fearless in her missions. Tubman used various disguises and strategies to avoid capture. Sometimes she would dress as a man, other times as an old woman. She carried forged papers and traveled on weekends when enslaved people had more freedom of movement and when newspapers would not print runaway notices until Monday. Tubman used songs to communicate coded messages, signaling when it was safe to move or when danger was near. The risks Tubman took were immense. After the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which required that escaped slaves be returned to their enslavers even if they reached free states, Tubman had to lead people all the way to Canada to ensure their safety. Slave catchers and bounty hunters actively pursued her, and rewards for her capture eventually totaled $40,000, an enormous sum at the time. Yet she was never caught and never lost a passenger. Her reputation grew among both those who sought freedom and those who sought to prevent it. Enslaved people called her Moses, after the biblical figure who led the Israelites out of bondage in Egypt. Tubman embraced this identity, seeing her work as divinely inspired. Southern slaveholders called her a dangerous criminal and desperately wanted to stop her operations. Harriet Tubman was not working alone in her efforts. She collaborated with other abolitionists, both black and white, who formed the Underground Railroad network. She worked closely with Thomas Garrett, a Quaker abolitionist in Wilmington, Delaware, and William Still, a black abolitionist in Philadelphia who documented the stories of escaped slaves. Tubman also became acquainted with Frederick Douglass, the famous formerly enslaved writer and orator, and John Brown, the radical abolitionist who believed armed insurrection was necessary to end slavery. Tubman supported Brown's plans and helped him recruit followers, though she was ill and could not participate in his famous raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859. When Brown was executed, Tubman mourned him as a martyr to the cause of freedom. During the 1850s, Tubman also became a public figure in abolitionist circles. She spoke at meetings and gatherings, telling her story and advocating for the end of slavery. Though she could not read or write, having been denied education as an enslaved person, Tubman was an effective and powerful speaker. Her first-hand accounts of slavery's brutality and her daring rescue missions inspired audiences throughout the North. She worked alongside other prominent abolitionists and women's rights activists, including Susan B. Anthony and other suffragists who saw connections between the struggle for racial justice and women's equality. Tubman supported women's suffrage throughout her life, believing that all people deserved equal rights and dignity. When the Civil War began in 1861, Harriet Tubman saw it as the opportunity to strike a decisive blow against slavery. She immediately offered her services to the Union Army. In 1862, Tubman went to South Carolina to serve as a nurse, treating wounded soldiers and refugees who had escaped from plantations as Union forces advanced through the South. Her knowledge of herbal medicines, learned during her years in slavery, proved valuable in treating dysentery and other diseases that plagued the army camps. But Tubman's contributions went far beyond nursing. Union commanders recognized her unique skills and experience, and she became a scout and spy for the Union Army. Harriet Tubman was the first woman to lead an armed military raid in American history. In June 1863, she guided Colonel James Montgomery and his 2nd South Carolina Volunteers in a raid along the Combahee River in South Carolina. Tubman had scouted the area, identified Confederate supply routes and torpedoes planted in the river, and spread word to enslaved people that liberation was coming. When the raid commenced, more than 700 enslaved people rushed to the Union gunboats to claim their freedom. The raid also destroyed millions of dollars worth of Confederate supplies and infrastructure. It was a stunning success, and Tubman's role was instrumental. Yet despite her critical military service, Tubman was never properly compensated by the Army and had to fight for decades to receive a military pension. Throughout the war, Tubman continued her intelligence work, moving through Confederate territory and gathering information from enslaved people about troop movements, supply lines, and fortifications. Her network of informants was extensive and reliable. The information she provided helped Union forces plan their operations and avoid ambushes. Tubman's work as a spy was dangerous and exhausting, but she never hesitated. She believed the war was a holy crusade to end the evil of slavery, and she was determined to do everything in her power to ensure Union victory and emancipation. When President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1, 1863, declaring enslaved people in Confederate territory to be free, Tubman celebrated it as a step toward justice, though she knew the fight was far from over. After the Civil War ended in 1865 with Union victory and the abolition of slavery through the 13th Amendment, Harriet Tubman faced new challenges. She returned to Auburn, New York, where she had settled before the war and where she had brought her parents to live in a home she purchased. Tubman had married again in 1869 to a Union veteran named Nelson Davis, who was more than 20 years her younger. They had a loving relationship until his death in 1888. Despite her fame and her service to the nation, Tubman struggled financially for much of her later life. The government was slow to recognize her military service and grant her proper compensation. She received a small pension as the widow of Nelson Davis, but it was inadequate given her own contributions. Harriet Tubman devoted her later years to helping others, just as she had throughout her life. She was active in the women's suffrage movement, speaking at conventions and advocating for women's right to vote. Tubman saw no contradiction between fighting for racial justice and gender equality. She believed all forms of oppression were connected and must be challenged. She also worked to support elderly and indigent African Americans in her community. In 1896, Tubman purchased land adjacent to her home in Auburn and began raising funds to establish a home for aged and needy black people. After years of effort, the Harriet Tubman Home for the Aged opened in 1908, providing care and dignity to those who had nowhere else to turn. Tubman also worked to preserve her own legacy and tell her story. In 1869, Sarah Bradford published a biography of Tubman based on extensive interviews, and the proceeds helped Tubman pay off her debts. A revised edition appeared in 1886. These books brought Tubman's story to a wider audience and cemented her place in American history. Yet even as her fame grew, Tubman remained humble and focused on service rather than personal glory. She lived simply and gave generously to those in need. Tubman was deeply religious throughout her life, attending the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church in Auburn and crediting God with guiding her through every danger and challenge. Her faith was not passive but active, demanding that believers work for justice and liberation. In her final years, Harriet Tubman's health declined. The head injury she suffered as a teenager continued to cause seizures and pain. She underwent brain surgery in 1898, reportedly refusing anesthesia and instead biting down on a bullet as she had seen soldiers do during the Civil War. The surgery provided some relief but could not reverse decades of suffering. Tubman also battled pneumonia and other ailments. In 1911, she became too frail to care for herself and was admitted to the rest home she had founded, spending her last days in the institution she had created to help others. Surrounded by friends and family, Tubman remained alert and engaged until near the end, telling stories of her adventures and encouraging others to continue the fight for justice. On March 10, 1913, Harriet Tubman died at approximately 91 years of age. Her funeral was held at the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church in Auburn, and she was buried with military honors, a fitting recognition of her service to the nation. The city of Auburn mourned her passing, as did people across the country who had been inspired by her courage and dedication. In the years following her death, Tubman's reputation only grew. She became a symbol of resistance to oppression and a reminder that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things through courage, faith, and determination. Schools, museums, and monuments have been named in her honor, and her story has been told and retold in books, films, and educational programs. Harriet Tubman's legacy is multifaceted and profound. She was a liberator who risked everything to free others from bondage, making the dangerous journey into slave territory again and again when she could have remained safely in the North. She was a military leader who served her country with distinction during its greatest crisis, providing intelligence and leading troops in combat. She was an activist who fought for women's suffrage and civil rights, recognizing that the struggle for justice is never finished. She was a humanitarian who cared for the sick, the elderly, and the poor, establishing institutions to serve those in need. And she was a symbol of the indomitable human spirit, proving that even the most oppressive systems can be overcome through courage and faith. Tubman's story resonates across generations because it speaks to fundamental human aspirations for freedom and dignity. She was born into a system designed to crush her spirit and deny her humanity, yet she refused to accept that fate. She escaped slavery not to enjoy personal freedom alone but to return and liberate others, putting herself in constant danger for the sake of people she loved and people she had never met. Tubman understood that true freedom is not individual but collective, that no one can be fully free while others remain in bondage. This insight drove her work on the Underground Railroad and her activism in later years. She never stopped fighting for a more just and equal society. The obstacles Tubman overcame were staggering. She was a woman in a time when women had few rights and little power. She was black in a society built on white supremacy and racial hierarchy. She was illiterate in a culture that valued education and formal learning. She was poor in a nation increasingly defined by wealth and economic status. She suffered from a debilitating medical condition that could strike at any moment, causing seizures and unconsciousness. Yet none of these barriers stopped her. Tubman turned every disadvantage into a source of strength. Her experience of slavery gave her the knowledge and determination to fight it. Her gender allowed her to move through certain spaces with less suspicion. Her faith gave her courage when fear might have paralyzed others. Harriet Tubman was not a perfect person, and she did not accomplish her goals alone. She worked within networks of abolitionists and allies who shared her commitment to ending slavery. She benefited from the changing political landscape that made the Civil War and emancipation possible. She made difficult choices, including carrying a gun and threatening to use it on those who might endanger her missions. But these complexities make her story more powerful, not less. Tubman was a real person who faced real dilemmas and made real sacrifices. She did not have the luxury of moral purity or simple choices. She lived in a world of violence and oppression and fought back with every tool at her disposal. The recognition Tubman has received in recent years reflects a growing appreciation for her contributions and a broader understanding of American history. For too long, the stories of women and people of color were marginalized or ignored in historical narratives. Tubman's story challenges us to expand our understanding of heroism and leadership. She was not a president or a general in the conventional sense, though she led people to freedom and commanded respect from military leaders. She was not wealthy or formally educated, yet she outwitted and outmaneuvered those who sought to capture her. Tubman demonstrated that courage and moral clarity are more important than social status or formal credentials. In 2016, the United States Treasury announced that Harriet Tubman would be featured on the $20 bill, replacing Andrew Jackson, a slaveholder and president responsible for the forced removal of Native Americans. This decision sparked debate but also reflected Tubman's iconic status. She would be the first African American and the first woman in more than a century to appear on U.S. paper currency. Though the redesign has been delayed, the very fact that Tubman was chosen represents a significant shift in how Americans understand their history and whom they choose to honor. Tubman's image on currency would be a daily reminder of the nation's complicated past and its ongoing struggle to live up to its ideals of freedom and equality. Harriet Tubman's life spanned nearly a century of American history, from the height of slavery through the Civil War and Reconstruction into the early 20th century. She witnessed tremendous change and was an agent of that change, helping to bring about the end of slavery and the expansion of rights for African Americans and women. Yet Tubman also saw how much work remained to be done. Even after slavery ended, Black Americans faced discrimination, violence, and economic exploitation. Even after women gained the right to vote in 1920, 7 years after Tubman's death, true equality remained elusive. Tubman understood that freedom is not a destination but a continuous struggle, requiring vigilance and courage from every generation. Today, Harriet Tubman stands as one of the most admired figures in American history. Her story is taught in schools across the country. The Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad National Historical Park preserves sites associated with her life and work in Maryland. The Harriet Tubman National Historical Park in Auburn, New York, includes her home and the residence for the elderly that she founded. Countless books, documentaries, and works of art have explored her life and legacy. Tubman has become a cultural icon, appearing on postage stamps, in statues and murals, and in popular culture. She represents the best of the American spirit, the refusal to accept injustice, the willingness to sacrifice for others, and the belief that ordinary people can change the world. Harriet Tubman was even in death an inspiration to future generations, a woman who proved that one person's courage can make an extraordinary difference in the lives of many. Sojourner Truth was a woman born into slavery who became a powerful voice for freedom and equality. Sojourner Truth, one of America's most famous abolitionists and women's rights advocates, was born Isabella Baum-Free in Swartkill, Ulster County, New York around 1797. She came from nothing, owned as property from birth. Truth's physical presence was commanding, standing nearly 6 feet tall with a deep, resonant voice that could quiet any room. Her early years were marked by unspeakable hardship. She was born enslaved, the property of a Dutch-speaking family in rural New York. Young Isabella spoke only Dutch in her childhood, which would later cause her difficulties when she was sold to English-speaking masters. Then in 1806, when she was just 9 years old, she was torn from her mother's arms and sold at auction along with a flock of sheep for $100. The trauma of that separation would haunt her for the rest of her life. Isabella was sold several times during her youth, experiencing brutal treatment at the hands of various owners. She endured beatings and abuse that left scars on her body and soul. In 1815, she met and fell in love with an enslaved man named Robert from a neighboring farm, but his owner forbade their relationship and beat Robert severely when he tried to see her. Isabella never saw him again. Instead, around 1817, her owner arranged for her to marry an older enslaved man named Thomas, with whom she would have 5 children. The marriage was not born of love but of the cruel economics of slavery, where human beings were bred like livestock to increase their owner's wealth. Isabella worked in the fields and in the house, laboring without compensation, without freedom, without hope of a different life. But Isabella possessed an inner strength and a deep religious faith that sustained her through these dark years. She prayed constantly, finding solace in her conversations with God. She believed that God heard her prayers and would one day deliver her from bondage. That day came sooner than she expected, though not through divine intervention alone. In 1799, New York State had passed a gradual emancipation law, which promised freedom to enslaved people born before 1799 on July 4, 1827. Isabella's owner, John Dumont, had promised to free her 1 year early if she worked hard and behaved well. She did exactly that, but when the time came, Dumont broke his promise, claiming that an injury to her hand had reduced her productivity. Betrayed and furious, Isabella made a decision that would change her life forever. In 1826, just months before the Emancipation Law would free her anyway, she escaped. She took her infant daughter Sophia and walked away from the Dumont farm before dawn, leaving behind her husband and her other children. She found refuge with Isaac and Maria Van Wagen, a Quaker couple who opposed slavery. When Dumont came looking for her, Isaac Van Wagen paid him $25 for Isabella and immediately set her free. She took the name Isabella Van Wagen in gratitude to the couple who had helped her. But her trials were not over. She soon discovered that her 5-year-old son Peter had been illegally sold by Dumont to an Alabama slave owner, despite New York law forbidding such sales. Isabella Van Wagen did something almost unheard of for a black woman in 1828. She took a white man to court and won. With the help of Quaker friends, she sued for the return of her son and prevailed, becoming one of the first black women to win such a case against a white man in an American court. When Peter was returned to her, his back was covered with scars from beatings. The reunion was bittersweet, as years of separation and trauma had damaged their relationship. Isabella moved to New York City in 1829 with her 2 youngest children, seeking work and a new life. She found employment as a domestic servant and became involved with various religious movements that were sweeping through the city. She joined the Methodist Church and became known for her powerful prayers and her ability to sing hymns with extraordinary emotion. But she also fell in with a religious cult led by a man named Robert Matthews, who called himself Matthias and claimed to be a prophet. The cult lived communally and practiced beliefs that were considered bizarre and dangerous by mainstream society. When the community collapsed in scandal and violence, Isabella found herself caught up in accusations and legal troubles, though she was eventually cleared of any wrongdoing. The experience left her disillusioned with organized religion, but not with God. Her faith remained strong, but she began to seek a more personal, direct relationship with the divine. On June 1, 1843, Isabella Van Wagen had a profound spiritual experience. She heard a voice calling her to leave the city and travel east, preaching the truth of God's word. She believed this was a divine command, and she obeyed without hesitation. She changed her name to Sojourner Truth, choosing a name that reflected her new mission. Sojourner meant traveler, and truth represented what she intended to speak. At the age of 46, with almost no money and no clear destination, she set out on foot from New York City. Sojourner Truth walked through Long Island and Connecticut, stopping at camp meetings and churches to preach. She spoke about her experiences in slavery, about her faith in God, and about the need for moral reformation in America. Her speeches were unlike anything people had heard before. She had no formal education and could neither read nor write, but she possessed a natural eloquence and a commanding presence that captivated audiences. Her voice was deep and powerful, and she sang hymns that moved people to tears. She quoted the Bible from memory, having learned scripture by having others read it to her. She was not a Thomas Jefferson or Frederick Douglass, any of the educated intellectuals who were leading the reform movements. She was something entirely different, a former slave woman who spoke with raw authenticity and moral authority. In late 1843, Sojourner Truth arrived at the Northampton Association of Education and Industry in Massachusetts, a utopian community dedicated to abolition and equality. There she met leading abolitionists including William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, and David Ruggles. These reformers recognized Truth's unique gifts and encouraged her to speak publicly against slavery. She began to travel the abolitionist lecture circuit, sharing the stage with famous speakers and telling her story to audiences throughout the North. Truth's speeches were powerful because they came from lived experience. She could describe the pain of being sold away from her mother, the agony of watching her son being beaten, the humiliation of being treated as property rather than a person. White audiences who might have dismissed slavery as an abstract political issue could not ignore the testimony of a woman who bore its scars. In 1850, Truth dictated her autobiography to a friend named Olive Gilbert. The narrative of Sojourner Truth was published and sold at her lectures, providing her with income to support herself. The book brought her story to an even wider audience and established her as one of the leading voices of the abolitionist movement. But Sojourner Truth was not content to fight only against slavery. She also became an advocate for women's rights, recognizing that women, like enslaved people, were denied basic human dignity and legal rights. In 1851, Truth attended the Ohio Women's Rights Convention in Akron, where she delivered what would become her most famous speech. The exact words she spoke that day are disputed, as different people recorded different versions, but the speech that became known as "Ain't I a Woman" electrified the audience. Truth challenged the prevailing notions that women were too delicate and fragile to vote or participate in public life. She pointed to her own strength and endurance, forged in the fires of slavery. She had plowed fields and gathered harvests and borne children who were sold away from her, and no man had ever helped her into carriages or lifted her over mud puddles. She demanded to know why, if she could do all these things, she should not have the same rights as any man. The speech was a powerful rebuke to both racism and sexism, delivered by a woman who embodied the intersection of both forms of oppression. Truth's feminism was not the genteel reform movement of middle-class white women. It was rooted in the harsh realities of being a black woman in America, subject to both racial and gender discrimination. Throughout the 1850s, Truth continued to travel and speak, facing hostile crowds and physical danger. She was sometimes attacked by mobs who opposed her message of abolition and equality. In Indiana, a group of men claimed she was actually a man in disguise and demanded that she expose her breasts to prove her sex. Truth responded with characteristic courage and dignity, shaming the men for their crudeness while making clear that her womanhood should not be in question. She survived on donations from supporters and sales of her book and photographs. She sold carts to visit, small photographic portraits, with the caption "I sell the shadow to support the substance," meaning she sold images of herself to support her actual body and her mission. These photographs spread her image across the country and helped make her one of the most recognizable figures of her time. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, Truth saw it as the fulfillment of her prophecies. She had long believed that slavery could only be ended through divine judgment, and she interpreted the war as God's punishment on America for the sin of slavery. She worked to gather supplies for black volunteer regiments and spoke at rallies supporting the Union cause. In 1864, at the age of 67, Truth traveled to Washington, D.C. to meet President Abraham Lincoln. The meeting took place in October, just weeks before Lincoln's re-election. Truth presented Lincoln with a Bible from the colored people of Baltimore, and Lincoln signed her autograph book, Writing for Auntie Sojourner Truth. The meeting was brief but meaningful to Truth, who saw Lincoln as an instrument of God's will in ending slavery. After the war, Truth remained in Washington, working with the Freedmen's Bureau to help formerly enslaved people transition to freedom. She was appointed to work at Freedmen's Hospital, where she counseled and assisted refugees who had fled to the capital seeking safety and opportunity. But Truth was appalled by the conditions she found in the refugee camps and the failure of the government to provide adequate support for the free people. She became convinced that the solution was to resettle freed slaves on public lands in the West, where they could own property and become self-sufficient farmers. She launched a petition campaign to Congress, traveling throughout the North collecting signatures and lobbying politicians. Though she gathered thousands of signatures, Congress never acted on her proposal. The failure of Reconstruction and the betrayal of promises made to freed people was a bitter disappointment to Truth in her final years. Truth returned to Michigan, where she had purchased a home in Battle Creek in 1857. She continued to speak occasionally on topics including prison reform, temperance, and the rights of freed people, but her health was declining. She suffered from ulcers on her legs that caused her great pain and limited her mobility. Still, she remained active in her community and received visitors from around the world who wanted to meet the famous Sojourner Truth. She was visited by reformers, journalists, and admirers who came to hear her stories and seek her wisdom. In her old age, Truth reflected on the changes she had witnessed in her lifetime. She had been born a slave in a nation that considered black people property, and she had lived to see slavery abolished and black men granted the right to vote. Yet she also saw how far America still had to travel toward true equality. The rights she had fought for were being rolled back during the backlash of the post-Reconstruction era. Violence against black Americans was increasing, and the promise of freedom was proving hollow for many. Truth never learned to read or write, despite attempts by friends to teach her in her later years. She said her mind was too busy with other things to focus on letters. Instead, she dictated her correspondence and relied on friends to read to her. Her illiteracy did not diminish her intelligence or her impact. She possessed a sharp mind and a remarkable memory, and her speeches demonstrated sophisticated understanding of politics, religion, and human nature. She used humor, biblical references, and personal testimony to make complex arguments accessible to ordinary people. On November 26, 1883, Sojourner Truth died at her home in Battle Creek, Michigan. She was approximately 86 years old, though her exact age was uncertain because records of enslaved births were rarely kept. She was surrounded by friends and family, and her funeral was one of the largest ever held in Battle Creek. Thousands of people, black and white, came to pay their respects to the woman who had dedicated her life to fighting for justice. When she died, she left behind a legacy that transcended her own life. She had inspired countless people to join the fights against slavery and for women's rights. She had demonstrated that moral authority came not from education or social position but from integrity and courage. Sojourner Truth was even in death a unifying figure, though not in the way George Washington had been. Washington unified a nation of free white men by establishing the precedent of peaceful transfer of power. Truth unified the movements for abolition and women's rights by insisting that freedom was indivisible, that no one could be truly free while others remained in bondage. Her legacy lived on in the continuing struggles for civil rights and equality. In the 20th century, Truth became an icon for multiple movements. Feminists claimed her as a pioneer of women's liberation. Civil rights activists honored her as an early freedom fighter. Her image appeared on postage stamps and in textbooks, though often sanitized and simplified. The real Sojourner Truth was more complex and more radical than the symbol she became. She was a woman of deep contradictions. She was deeply religious yet critical of churches that supported slavery. She was illiterate yet intellectually formidable. She advocated non-violence yet supported the Union Army's war against the Confederacy. She believed in racial uplift and self-help yet also demanded that the government provide reparations to freed slaves in the form of land grants. She worked within the system, petitioning Congress and meeting with presidents, yet she also fundamentally challenged that system by insisting that it recognized the full humanity of black people and women. Truth's life spanned nearly the entire 19th century, from the early years of the Republic through Reconstruction. She witnessed and participated in the most important social movements of her era. She was not a behind-the-scenes organizer or a writer of manifestos. She was a public speaker and a living witness, using her voice and her presence to challenge injustice wherever she found it. Her speeches were not carefully crafted essays but spontaneous performances, mixing humor and pathos, scripture and personal testimony, challenge and inspiration. No two speeches were exactly alike, as she adapted her message to each audience and occasion. This makes it difficult for historians to capture the full impact of her oratory, since we have only fragmentary and often unreliable records of what she actually said. What we do know is that she moved people, that she changed minds, that she inspired action. She made slavery and women's oppression real and immediate to audiences who might otherwise have remained indifferent. She forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about American society and about themselves. Sojourner Truth never held political office or commanded armies or accumulated wealth. She died with little money and few possessions. But she wielded influence through the force of her personality and the power of her words. She showed that even the most marginalized people could make their voices heard and could shape history. Her life was a testament to human resilience and dignity. She survived the worst that slavery could inflict and emerged not broken but strengthened, not bitter but determined to prevent others from suffering as she had. She transformed her pain into purpose and her suffering into a call for justice. In doing so, she became one of the most important figures in American history, a woman whose influence extended far beyond her own time. The lessons of Sojourner Truth's life remain relevant today. Her insistence that different forms of oppression are interconnected, that racism and sexism must be fought together, anticipates modern intersectional feminism. Her advocacy for economic justice and land redistribution speaks to ongoing debates about reparations and wealth inequality. Her willingness to speak uncomfortable truths to power provides a model for contemporary activists. Most fundamentally, her life demonstrates that ordinary people, even those born into the most oppressive circumstances, can become agents of historical change. Sojourner Truth was not born to privilege or power. She had every disadvantage that American society could impose. Yet she refused to accept the limitations others placed on her, and she dedicated her life to expanding freedom for everyone. That is why we remember her, why we study her, why her story continues to inspire new generations of people fighting for justice and equality in their own times. William Lloyd Garrison was a fiery abolitionist and radical reformer who became one of the most uncompromising voices against slavery in American history. William Lloyd Garrison, the passionate newspaper editor and moral crusader, was born in Newburyport, Massachusetts on December 10, 1805. He came from humble beginnings, the son of an immigrant sailing master who abandoned the family when William was just 3 years old. Garrison's childhood was marked by poverty and hardship. His mother Fanny struggled to support 3 children, sometimes forced to place young William with other families when she could not feed him herself. Despite these difficulties, his mother instilled in him a deep Baptist faith and a strong moral compass that would guide his entire life. Garrison received only a basic education in the public schools of Newburyport. He was homeschooled by his mother in religious matters and learned the values of hard work and perseverance through necessity. At age 13, Garrison was apprenticed to a shoemaker, but he found the work unfulfilling. His true calling came when he was apprenticed to the editor of the Newburyport Herald at age 14. There, Garrison learned the printing trade and discovered his gift for writing. He spent 7 years as an apprentice printer, absorbing the craft of journalism and developing the powerful writing style that would make him famous. By age 20, he had become the editor of his own newspaper, though that first venture failed quickly. In the late 1820s, Garrison began to focus his attention on the issue of slavery. He was not initially an abolitionist. Like many Americans of his time, he first supported the colonization movement, which sought to send freed slaves back to Africa. This was considered a moderate position, one that acknowledged slavery was wrong but did not demand immediate action or equality for Black Americans. Garrison worked briefly as the editor of a temperance newspaper in Vermont, where he also began writing about political issues. His views were evolving, becoming more radical with each passing year. The transformation of William Lloyd Garrison from moderate reformer to radical abolitionist came through his friendship with Benjamin Lundy, a Quaker abolitionist who published the newspaper Genius of Universal Emancipation. In 1829, Garrison moved to Baltimore to work as co-editor of Lundy's paper. There, in the heart of a slave state, Garrison witnessed the horrors of slavery firsthand. He saw slave coffles being marched through the streets, families torn apart at auction, and the brutal reality of human bondage. The experience radicalized him completely. Garrison rejected colonization and embraced immediate abolition. He began writing fierce denunciations of slavery and those who profited from it. Garrison's uncompromising rhetoric got him into trouble almost immediately. In 1830, he wrote an article accusing a Newburyport merchant of engaging in the domestic slave trade by transporting slaves to Louisiana. The merchant sued for libel, and Garrison was convicted and sentenced to jail. He could not pay the fine and spent 7 weeks in a Baltimore jail cell. Far from silencing him, the imprisonment only strengthened his resolve. Garrison used his time in jail to write poetry and essays about slavery. He emerged from prison more determined than ever to dedicate his life to the abolition of slavery. After his release from jail, Garrison returned to the North with a mission. He would start his own newspaper, one devoted entirely to the immediate abolition of slavery without compensation to slaveholders. On January 1, 1831, the first issue of the Liberator was published in Boston. Garrison was the editor, publisher, and primary writer. He had almost no money, few subscribers, and no financial backing. The newspaper operated out of a small office with borrowed equipment. But what the Liberator lacked in resources, it made up for in passion and conviction. The first issue of the Liberator announced Garrison's philosophy in unmistakable terms. He wrote that he would be harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice on the subject of slavery. He declared that he would not equivocate, he would not excuse, he would not retreat a single inch, and he would be heard. These words became his manifesto. Garrison rejected the gradualist approach that most anti-slavery advocates favored. He demanded immediate emancipation. He called slavery a sin and slaveholders sinners. He refused to compromise or soften his message to make it more palatable to those who were uncomfortable with his radicalism. The Liberator never achieved a large circulation. At its peak, it had only about 3,000 subscribers, and most of those were free black Americans in the North who supported Garrison's uncompromising stance. White Americans, even many who opposed slavery, found Garrison's rhetoric too extreme. He not only attacked slavery but also attacked the Constitution itself, calling it a covenant with death and an agreement with hell because it protected slavery. Garrison burned a copy of the Constitution in public to demonstrate his contempt for a document that sanctioned human bondage. Such actions horrified moderate Americans who believed in working within the system. Garrison's radical abolitionism made him one of the most hated men in America. In the South, he was seen as a dangerous fanatic who threatened the entire social and economic order. Southern states passed laws making it illegal to distribute abolitionist literature. Rewards were offered for Garrison's capture, with some bounties reaching thousands of dollars. Southern politicians blamed Garrison and his newspaper for inciting slave rebellions. When Nat Turner led a slave revolt in Virginia in August 1831, just months after the Liberator began publication, many Southerners held Garrison responsible, though there was no evidence Turner had ever seen the newspaper. But Garrison was not safe in the North either. Many Northern businessmen had economic ties to the South and feared that agitation over slavery would disrupt profitable trade relationships. Northern workers feared that freed slaves would compete with them for jobs. Racial prejudice was widespread even among those who opposed slavery. In October 1835, a mob attacked Garrison in Boston. He was dragged through the streets with a rope around his body. The mob intended to tar and feather him or worse. He was only saved when the mayor intervened and had him placed in jail for his own protection. The Boston mob violence shocked many Americans and actually helped Garrison's cause by demonstrating the violent opposition to free speech. In 1833, Garrison helped found the American Anti-Slavery Society, an organization dedicated to immediate abolition. He wrote its Declaration of Sentiments, which called for the immediate end of slavery without compensation to slaveholders and full equality for black Americans. The society grew rapidly, establishing chapters throughout the North and sending out lecturers to spread the abolitionist message. For several years, Garrison was the leading figure in the organized abolition movement. He traveled extensively, giving speeches and organizing new anti-slavery societies. Garrison's abolitionism was intertwined with other radical causes. He was an early supporter of women's rights, insisting that women should have full participation in the anti-slavery movement. This position was controversial even among abolitionists. When women began speaking publicly against slavery, they faced harsh criticism. Garrison defended their right to speak and to participate equally in the movement. His support for women's rights led to a major split in the abolition movement in 1840. More conservative abolitionists formed a separate organization that excluded women from leadership roles. Garrison remained with the American Anti-Slavery Society, which welcomed women as full members. Garrison also embraced Christian perfectionism and non-resistance. He believed that true Christians should not participate in violence or in government, which he saw as inherently coercive and violent. He refused to vote or hold office. He opposed all wars and all use of force. This pacifist philosophy put him at odds with abolitionists who believed that slavery might need to be ended through violence. When John Brown raided Harper's Ferry in 1859, attempting to start a slave rebellion through armed insurrection, many abolitionists praised Brown as a martyr. Garrison was conflicted. He admired Brown's courage and dedication but could not endorse his violent methods, though his pacifism began to waver in the face of slavery's intransigence. Throughout the 1840s and 1850s, Garrison continued to publish The Liberator and to agitate for abolition. He attacked not only slavery but also the churches that tolerated it, the politicians who compromised with it, and the Constitution that protected it. He called for the North to secede from the South, arguing that free states should not be complicit in slavery. His slogan was "No union with slaveholders." This position seemed impractical to many Americans who believed the Union must be preserved. Garrison countered that a Union built on slavery was not worth preserving. Garrison's influence on the abolition movement was profound but also divisive. His uncompromising moral stance inspired many to join the cause, particularly free black Americans who saw in Garrison a white ally who truly believed in racial equality. Frederick Douglass, the famous escaped slave and abolitionist leader, initially worked closely with Garrison and credited him with helping to launch his career as a speaker and writer. But even Douglass eventually broke with Garrison over questions of tactics and philosophy. Douglass came to believe that the Constitution could be interpreted as an anti-slavery document and that political action was necessary. Garrison rejected both positions. The 1850s brought increasing sectional tension over slavery. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 required Northerners to assist in capturing escaped slaves, making them complicit in slavery. Garrison denounced the law and supported those who violated it. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 opened new territories to slavery, leading to violent conflict in Kansas. The Dred Scott decision of 1857 declared that black Americans could not be citizens. Each of these events seemed to vindicate Garrison's argument that compromise with slavery was impossible and that the conflict could only be resolved through the complete abolition of the institution. When the Civil War began in April 1861, Garrison faced a dilemma. As a pacifist, he opposed war. But he recognized that the war might end slavery. Initially, President Lincoln insisted the war was only about preserving the Union, not about ending slavery. Garrison criticized Lincoln for not making abolition the war's goal. But when Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1, 1863, declaring slaves in rebel states to be free, Garrison praised the president. He began to support the war effort as a crusade for freedom. His pacifist principles gave way to the practical reality that slavery would be ended through military force. Garrison lived to see the triumph of his life's work. The 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery throughout the United States, was ratified in December 1865. After 35 years of publication, Garrison decided to cease publication of The Liberator. The final issue appeared on December 29, 1865. In his farewell editorial, Garrison declared that his work was done. Slavery had been abolished. The immediate goal he had fought for since 1831 had been achieved. He was 60 years old and ready to step back from the front lines of reform. But Garrison did not retire from public life entirely. He continued to speak out on issues of justice and equality. He supported the 14th and 15th Amendments, which granted citizenship and voting rights to black Americans. He recognized that legal freedom was not enough and that true equality required ongoing struggle. He continued to support women's rights, temperance, and other reform causes. He also worked to support the freedmen in the South, raising money for schools and advocating for their rights. Garrison's later years were marked by financial struggle. He had never made money from the Liberator, which operated at a loss for its entire existence. He had supported his family through gifts from supporters and occasional paid lectures. In 1867, his admirers raised a fund of over $30,000 to provide for his old age. This financial security allowed him to live comfortably in his final years. He divided his time between Boston and New York, where his daughter lived. William Lloyd Garrison's health declined in the 1870s. He suffered from various ailments and gradually reduced his public activities. He made his last public appearance in 1879, attending a meeting of the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. On May 24, 1879, William Lloyd Garrison died in New York City at the age of 73. His funeral was held in Boston, and he was buried in the Forest Hill Cemetery. Thousands mourned his passing, recognizing him as one of the great moral crusaders of the 19th century. Garrison's legacy is complex and controversial. He was unquestionably one of the most important figures in the abolition movement. His uncompromising moral stance helped to shift public opinion on slavery from seeing it as a necessary evil to recognizing it as an absolute wrong that must be immediately ended. He gave voice to the radical idea that black Americans deserved not just freedom but full equality. He challenged the churches, the government, and the Constitution itself to live up to their professed ideals. His newspaper, though small in circulation, had an enormous impact on the national debate over slavery. Yet Garrison's methods were also criticized, both in his own time and by later historians. His harsh rhetoric and his refusal to compromise alienated potential allies. His attacks on the Constitution and his call for disunion seemed impractical and even dangerous to many who opposed slavery but believed in working within the political system. His splits with other abolitionists over tactics and philosophy weakened the movement at crucial moments. Some historians argue that more moderate abolitionists who worked through politics were more effective in actually ending slavery than Garrison's moral crusading. Garrison himself would likely have rejected such criticisms. He believed that moral truth could not be compromised and that gradualism was simply another form of complicity with evil. He argued that his role was to hold up the ideal of immediate abolition and complete equality, even if practical politicians had to find ways to achieve those goals incrementally. He saw himself as a prophet calling society to repentance, not as a politician crafting legislation. His uncompromising stance, he believed, was necessary to move the center of debate and to make more moderate positions possible. The debate over Garrison's legacy reflects broader questions about social change and moral reform. How do societies confront deep-seated evils? Is uncompromising moral witness more effective than practical political compromise? Can radical agitators and moderate reformers work together, or do they inevitably come into conflict? These questions remain relevant today as Americans continue to grapple with issues of justice and equality. What is undeniable is that William Lloyd Garrison dedicated his entire adult life to the cause of abolition with a single-minded intensity that few have matched. He endured poverty, imprisonment, mob violence, and constant vilification. He never wavered in his commitment to immediate abolition and racial equality. He used the power of the written word to challenge his nation's conscience. He built a movement that, while never commanding majority support, helped to make slavery a central moral and political issue that the nation could no longer ignore. Garrison was a man of his time, shaped by the evangelical Christianity and reform movements of the early 19th century. But he was also ahead of his time in his commitment to racial equality and women's rights. He recognized that slavery was not just a political or economic issue but a moral evil that corrupted the entire society. He understood that ending slavery would require a fundamental transformation of American society and values. In this sense, he was a revolutionary, though one who believed in moral suasion rather than violent overthrow. William Lloyd Garrison remains a towering figure in American history, a man who heard the cries of the enslaved and devoted his life to their liberation. He was uncompromising, difficult, self-righteous, and absolutely certain of his moral rectitude. He was also courageous, principled, and unwavering in his commitment to justice. He challenged America to live up to its founding ideals of liberty and equality for all. His voice, harsh and uncompromising as it was, helped to end the greatest evil in American history and to push the nation toward a more perfect union.